We got this fun comment. Can you make this comment into a lettering sequence? I'm a huge fan. Thank you for teaching me important art skills that I would have never learned without you. Sure, but just to make this more interesting, let's letter your comment as if you were a demon who gets nauseous and throws up. First, we'll separate the comment text into natural breaks to form our sequence, touching up the kerning where needed. Once we've got the basic breakdown, we'll flip the balloon color to dark with a white outline. For extra creepy vibes, we'll roughen up the outside of the balloons and add some shaky connectors. Now for the nausea. We'll use a gross dripping effect at the bottom of this sequence, a literal interpretation of throwing up as we represent the spillover of liquid. We'll join those shapes with the sequence, then utilize a cartoonish green color as a gradient fade to represent the transition to vomiting during speaking. Lastly, we'll throw a gross onomatopoeia in a monstrous typeface below the balloon sequence. For some reason, the word blorf just screams demonic vomit to me. So thanks for your comment. Hope you get well soon. Here's a super common lettering question. Have you done singing? Well, this seems like a simple question, but it's actually one of the most complicated. Because singing and music are so incredibly varied. Just think about all the different genres and styles of music there are, then combine that with the different nuances of voice quality, the emotion of the singer, and all the other factors that you might want to visually express in your comic. For softer music, like a crooner in a smoky club, you could use warbly lines to represent the sound of a warm vibrato. Here, the singing feels like it's lazily drifting up and over the heads of a small group of jazz musicians. Or, if you're trying to show the screaming intensity of a punk rock singer, you could use large, angular typography exploding out of a spiky bubble. Everything about this lettering screams, well, screaming. But singing isn't always the focus of a scene. Your characters might not be on stage. They might be at the show, listening to the band, in which case the cacophony sits behind their dialogue. Here, you're representing music that is undeniably loud, but you're telling the reader, hey, there's a story continuing on top of it that you should pay more attention to. We've gotten dozens of comments asking the same question. How do you know what words or phrases to put in bold? Well, the answer, of course, is how people speak in different situations. For example, if someone were to tell you, it's amazing what bolding certain words can do in improving your comic lettering, you would probably say, yes, but how do you know what words or phrases to put in bold? And then if they said, well, it's dictated by the emphasis you're trying to convey, you might say, yes, but how do you know what words or phrases to put in bold? And then they might say, actually, it's not just words, you can bold entire phrases too. You might roll your eyes and say, yes, but how do you know what words or phrases to put in bold? And then they'd say, oh, and you can use other techniques to emphasize words, like underlining. Then you'd get mad and shout, yes, but how do you know what words or phrases to put in bold? And that's when they'd get mad and say, bold of you to assume I was ever going to answer your question in the first place. A recent commenter informed us, no offense, but this seems like one of those things that is simultaneously so obvious and insignificant that it wouldn't even be worth commenting on. Well, I'm glad you wrote no offense, so we know not to take offense. No one ever opens a comment with, no offense, but, and then says something inconsiderate. Wait, actually, look at this final balloon. It's way more horizontal than the rest of the rounder balloons in this sequence. That's something insignificant, and yet obvious now that I've pointed it out. Let's try and fix that awkwardly wide shape. The problem seems to be the word inconsiderate. It's just so much wider than everything else. Now, here some comic letterers would just hyphenate it. Personally, I don't love the hyphenated look. I'm going to remove the word inconsiderate entirely. Then we'll take the word inconsiderate and put it at a rakish angle with some extra punctuation to fill up that space. We can bring back our wide horizontal balloon, and when we join it with the others, we've created a fun mashup of shapes with far more intention behind the lettering. Now this feels like the right kind of playful sarcasm we're going for. Someone had a very specific request for us. Make this into a lettering sequence. I cast Thunder Spell. Sure, but you didn't specify any details about the character casting Thunder Spell, so we'll have to write some lore. Now, we could just use regular black text and white balloons, but that's boring. So I'm imagining that this character is a pink alien named Peppermint Fuzzykins, who is powered by pure joy. When they speak, the bright pink balloons represent their melodious innocence. Then, to represent their refreshingly minty breath, we'll build small candy cane icons and squeaky clean bursts. We'll place the candy canes and sparkles around the outside. Now, when you place objects around the outside of a speech balloon, they can lack cohesion with the design. So I'm going to create some additional shapes so it feels like the pink balloons are extended behind the candy canes, making them feel integrated into the balloon. And now we have Peppermint Fuzzykins casting one of their many elemental spells, powered by pure joy and innocence. Someone had a very specific question. Can you make this comment into a bubble thing? Maybe a skeleton who is really cold. Huh, sounds cool. Well, my first thought was to actually trace photos of bones to create cartoonish but anatomically accurate building blocks that could actually form balloon borders. Then use a Blambot font like Restless Soul to give it an extra spooky quality. And since our skeleton is meant to be really cold, let's use a classic deep blue gradient in the balloon and for the type itself. We can even create a blue border around the bone outline just to reinforce the chilliness. Now, here's a classic example of a highly stylized piece of lettering that looks super fun in a one-off social media video, but let's drop it on top of a real skeleton drawing that Lydia did for Interdimensional 3. And I hate it. It's too busy and the color system of the balloon clashes horribly with the established palette of the book. We've gone way too far with literal iconography, so let's start over. I like the idea that cold makes you shiver, so let's use a trembling outline, like we're depicting the clacking teeth of a cold skeleton. And just to really sell the idea of shivers, let's duplicate the shaky outline a couple times to create an additional sense of movement. Ultimately, what we get is a much more flexible lettering style that still retains a ton of character, but can be used on top of almost any color system, which means it's a great long-term choice for a main character. So that's how I'd do it. Someone who is very interested in audible bodily functions wants to know, question, how to make a huge belching sound in comics. Ah, I see that thee hath not read from the holy text. Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes is incredible at a lot of things, including the scenes in which Calvin burps loudly using large onomatopoeia typography. Let's grab some frames as reference, then paste them into the original vector file for our popular Vomiting Demon short, which you may have seen on our channel. This exercise won't be too different, but we'll use Wattersonian onomatopoeia to find our belching sound. Of course, you can go with a classic elongated burp, the more aggressive brap, but I love the utterly disgusting wet quality of something like blorg, which is not too different than blorf, actually. I love putting a sound effect like this on an arc so it feels like an upward burst of gas, and we can borrow our same cloud of dots for some extra gross accents. As far as how you'd actually use this in a comic, you might have a character speaking who is interrupted by their own burp. We can even do a slight gradient on the word balloon to indicate that the air changed from speaking to burping as they spoke. Stylistically, I think I actually like the clarity of black typography with a yellow or green outline. By keeping the burp typography black, it matches the color of normal speaking typography, indicating that the sound is still passing through their vocal cords. And that is how you utterly disgust your reader using principles of audio, psychology, and graphic design. I love specific scenarios like this one. How would you do lettering for someone trapped in the digital world and slowly becoming more corrupted and less human? Okay, get ready. Time to jack in. Since you used the word corrupted, I think it's fun to take inspiration from corrupted files and damaged media. So first I'll letter this sequence with normal human speech to give us a base. Then we'll grab a texture inspired by a corrupted image. I love this one because it feels halfway between modern digital corruption and VHS tracking error. We'll use a gradient mask to fade it on as the sequence progresses. Then, inspired by the horizontal lines of our corruption pattern, let's go to the type and create horizontal errors by chopping and shifting different words and letters. We'll actually increase the number of errors as we descend, creating more and more damage to the lettering as the character speaks. Next, I'll create a grid of squares inspired by classic pixel art. In the middle of our sequence, we'll add squares, but by the end, the squares can be both additive and subtractive. We can even double up the lettering by the end to create an almost anxiety-inducing amount of distortion. Full snow crash. Shortest question we ever got. How would I make someone whisper shout? A short question, but a really important one, because it's the perfect example of how you can juxtapose two basic lettering principles. Usually, shouting is represented by making the text bolder or larger, which can either increase the size of the surrounding balloon, or you can even conform the balloon more to the shape of the type, creating the sense that the words are bursting out of their container. it's fun if you chain together normal size type with the larger shouting type to reinforce the change in volume. You can even roughen up the stroke around the shouting balloon to create a strained, screaming quality to the design. Now, whispering is often represented by a dotted line, going all the way back to 1900s newspaper comics, so it's well established as an instant visual cheat for a lowered voice. What's fun is running a dotted line around large, screaming type, which instantly combines both principles into a literal whisper-shout. A great example of how lettering is an additive system of iconography. If you learn the building blocks, you can build your own solutions. This is kind of a morbid question. How about someone slowly drowning / getting fully submerged in water, like from words to incomprehensible bubbling? Luckily, we released a longer video about underwater robots that contains a ton of info about comic lettering in water-filled situations. For a person actually drowning, I'm going to borrow from some lettering I did for that video, where I used bubbles bursting out from the outside of the balloons. Then we'll type out our sequence during the drowning scene. Before we even begin styling the balloons, let's start to rotate the actual type near the end, so it feels like the person is actually becoming disoriented and trailing off into glub blubs. Then we'll put the lettering in the balloons. I love the idea of connecting each balloon with a trail of bubbles, but to add to the sense that this person is becoming more and more submerged, I'll make the first connector a more standard smooth line and the rest the bubble trails. Then let's add bubbles bursting out all around the sequence. The goal here is to make the bubbles more and more dense as we go down the chain of the balloons. This should feel like when you're underwater and yell and a trail of bubbles explodes out of your mouth and then dissipates upwards. We can even start to alter the color of the balloons near the bottom, both to create the sense that water is invading the lungs, but also to differentiate shapes near the more dense bubble clusters. What a dramatic ending for a noble film extra. One of the most common questions we get is, how would you depict telepathy? Do I have a tale to tell you? Speaking of tales, the real key to telepathy is erasing the tail of a speech balloon. Any floating bubble implies that the voice is emanating from somewhere that isn't a visible human mouth or face. And don't forget how much context you get through art and character. So if we place this lettering over someone who we've established to have telepathic abilities, there's almost no chance that this will be misunderstood. Of course, we can make the actual bubble design more elaborate. I've always loved this classic 1960s cat whisker thought balloon they used to use. And if that's too retro for you, you could always use those little whisker accents on a standard round bubble too. Using an extra thick outline could add a sense of weight or authority to the voice. And introducing color can give each bubble a signature look that helps with visual clarity if there's multiple characters communicating telepathically. For our telepathic skeleton king in Interdimensional, I used a black shaky balloon with green accents to give it an undead spooky quality that's also visually tied to the character design. And if you think it's weird that an oversized skeleton would telepathically give you health advice, then I'm afraid we've already printed it and it's available now. Someone with a lot of telepaths in their comic asked, how about lettering for a telepathic conversation between two characters when they're suddenly interrupted by a third unknown psychic voice? How would you keep the three parties clear and distinct when they may not be physically present? This is such a fun question. Luckily, in our last video about telepathy, we created a bunch of different styles for telepathy bubbles. As long as they float with no tail, you can make them look pretty much however you want. But I do personally prefer these old school cat whisker style bubbles. The extra decorations somehow feel like the perfect representation of a mental transmission. Then it's just a matter of building out our psychic conversation with the two styles, floating the bubbles in sequence, and writing their dialogue. And when it's time for the third voice to interrupt, we'll use a new, distinct style. The original speaker will respond to that third voice, and the conversation will speed up in intensity, which we'll represent by starting to overlap the bubbles. Now, once you see this red bubble, it does make the other two styles feel less distinct from each other. So if you want to differentiate them further, some people might recommend changing one character's font. Now, I'll be honest, I don't always love mixing fonts when there's already this much going on, because it can add to a sense of clutter in a tight panel. But I do like color and design as a solution. So I'll go in and add some tasteful embellishments, like a blue outer ring with a subtle white stroke. And then we can go back and change the font to match the other bubbles, which does help create a sense of design unity, despite how much we've differentiated the three speakers.
Here's a particularly intense comic lettering request. How would you do a character slowly getting more and more insane, like he has nothing to do to stop that, and he knows it, yet tries to fight it? Well, I've actually done this before. First, make some speech balloons that say, "I'm going more and more insane and I can do nothing to stop it." Then script out an entire comic book to go with this scene, and pass it to your childhood friend Lydia, who is a professional comic book artist. Lydia can do thumbnails, pencils, and inks for a surrealist story about a protagonist slowly descending into insanity. Then, after getting the line art back, I'd color the entire thing in both Akira-inspired black and white and 70s Marvel Conan the Barbarian-inspired color, creating a system so sophisticated that I needed to create a separate 15-minute video explaining the storytelling power of this color system. Then, while lettering the final pages, I'd probably realize that some of the most intense moments don't actually need lettering at all, thanks to Lydia's incredible abilities in facial expressions and body language. So I just delete the exposition-heavy dialogue in favor of Junji Ito-inspired minimalism. Then we'd publish the entire thing in both digital and print formats, and sell that Descent of Madness story on our website. Anyway, that's how we'd do it.
Look, a refreshingly smart question. Can you show me how to do this lettering? Someone is speaking in a foreign language and the other person is using a translator that speaks up. Nice, I love this. Since your username is in Chinese, I've asked a friend of mine to provide a sentence in simplified Chinese as a little tribute to you. The balloon with the Chinese characters is just a standard white speech balloon, indicating normal human speech. Now, since we specialize in sci-fi comics, I think I'll letter this as if the translator refers to a computer or device that can jump in and automatically translate what's being said in real time. For this purpose, I'll use a balloon style I used in Interdimensional called a radio balloon. The English translation goes inside, and then we can place the radio balloon slightly on top of the original speech balloon. How much it overlaps indicates the latency of the translator, whether it jumps in as the person speaks or waits for them to finish. You can either keep the radio balloon floating, which I honestly prefer in this case, but if you want, you can do a jagged mechanical style tail that originates from the device. Just remember to place the tail's origin at a peak or point along the radio balloon.
In the comments of our video about a translating device, somebody asked, "What about a human translator not accurately translating for nefarious reasons?" Ah, I see what you mean. Let's remove the radio balloon signifying an electronic voice and replace it with a standard human speech balloon. Then we'll replace the accurate translation with something that signifies an ulterior motive by someone who claims to be translating. Something that reveals a secret plan. Or something based in greed. Or something comically obvious in its salesmanship. Maybe we could even show that this charlatan is also psychically projecting a product image into the mind of the listener. Not only is this nefarious translator misrepresenting the original sentence, but they're using paranormal powers to try and sell merchandise. High-quality merchandise that helps support indie creators who spend a lot of time creating comic tutorials with unparalleled quality on modern social media. Yes, something like that.